Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to those of you that were here in week one, and for those of you that are here for the first time, welcome. I'm going to briefly run through a few slides that introduced about the course. I won't take long with this because I know most of you would have seen it. Why I'm asking, are you going to study this course? I was interested, by the way, to see what many of you were writing about your interest and why you were interested in this course. What I would say about this course is that it is meant to give you an insight into the resources of language, the power of language. Better understand how a text comes to mean what it does. And by so doing, by knowing what those resources are, being able to perhaps improve the effectiveness of your own use of language. And about the assessment. 10% will be an in-class exercise. This will involve work that will be done probably midterm through the semester, and homework assignments, because of the fact that many of you are you're not meeting as a class in person, face to face, and many of you would not have probably made relationships, connections with your classmates. Bearing that in mind, I've decided that the homework will be done on an individual basis. And that will count 40% of your grade. That will involve some text analysis. And finally, the examination is 50%. So you will be doing an in-class exercise that will count 10%. Homework assignments on your evaluated, assessed individually, 40%. And again, as I said, that will involve applying the methodology that you are learning from me in lecture in your own analysis of a text that I will be giving to you. And finally, the examination. Now, the topics that I'm covering, last week I already began with this idea of we're making meaning. And how we make meaning depends on the grammar. The grammar provides the means by which we make meaning. We're moving on eventually this week to go on to talk about text, texture, and architecture, and I'll be explaining what those terms mean. And we also are going to look at, in this course, examples of not like academic writing, speeches like I've been showing you, but also look at some poetry, what we call verbal art. Understanding what's going on in verbal art, verbal science, where does the creativity come from, the ability to be innovative with language. And we see that not just in poetry, but you see that in the language of science as well. And finally, what does it mean to look at a text in context? And how does the context influence the nature of the text? All right, so this is sort of sums up what we began with last week, what we were talking about. Now, I'd like to just, while I may, I'd like to point out something about what is in Zoom for you all. Let me find that. All right. Now, a few things before we go farther. If you go to Canvas, what you would be, a few things. First of all, the Introduce Yourself survey. Most of you have done this. There's still a few that have not, and some of you may be coming on this week and not have been aware of it. This is just an opportunity for me to get to know you a bit better. And you will find that there's a question there, and I ask you, I provide for you in the, and again, I'll go back to the files. And if you look at week 1, you will see there that there is the survey. And this survey asks you some questions about your background, your interest, what you've studied in terms of linguistics before. And so I ask you to complete this and submit this. It is not an assessed assignment. I'm not giving you a grade for it, but it is helpful to me. And I've been reading through these, and one of your classmates did it as a video instead of as a text, and that was very interesting. I do feel I have a better sense of who you are and what some of your interests are. And while it is not the same as face-to-face, it does give me a sense of who I'm engaging with in terms of this course. Now, under week 2, the files, you'll notice that the PowerPoints, I have one which is, they're both the PDF versions, and one is black and white, one is color. And also, there was a request for one of the videos that will be in today's lecture, and I put that up on this under week 2 as well. Something else I added on under readings, and I encourage you to look at this and start to be taking a look at some of these readings. They are quite relevant, and they are, one of them, in fact, is the proofs from the book that I co-authored with Professor Halliday, Text Linguistics. And the others are papers and sort of descriptions of some of the topics that we'll be talking about. I would encourage you, first of all, to be taking a look at functions and components and SFL key concepts, all right? This would be very relevant to especially what we talked about last week. This one, RST relations, you'll hear more about that this week. All right, so for those of you who have not done the Introduce Yourself survey, please do so. Remember to be looking at the announcements. The announcements will be each week telling you the Zoom details and also the links for the videos. So please check those out, and please do read the announcements. All right. All right, let's go back to the lecture. And today I'm going to very briefly, again, because it's last week, I realized it was drop and add, and some of you will be coming on new this week, and I'm not going to be covering it at all in the detail that I did last week, what I covered in the introduction. For that, please go back, and the link to the video is available. It's under the announcements, and look that up, and please go through and listen to that. All right, so making meaningful choices with whatever the grammar will allow. Let me read this. M.A.K. Halliday's Systemic Functional Linguistic Theory, and you will recall that that is the theoretical approach that I'm adopting here in looking at text linguistics. SFL describes language as a resource for making meaning. We make meaning to construe the phenomena of experience, to enact social relationships, to create discourse. What did we call those? The metafunctions, remember? Language provides the grammatical resources necessary for not only talking about our experience of the world around us and what is going on inside us, but also for communicating our attitudes toward and expectations of those with whom we are interacting. Halliday's systemic functional theory, which prioritizes the study of function over form, provides the theoretical, methodological basis for investigating the the aesthetic and functional values that differentiate one text from another or one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. So we talked about systematic functional linguistics, and we said that that is not what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with something that is indeed systematic. It is not truly logical. Language is analogical. We speak as we have heard, and we resemble what we have heard said. Instead, we're talking about the approach that we're taking, we said, is systemic functional linguistics. Why systemic? Because what we're dealing with are systems of choice, sets of semantic options, choices by which we make meaning. Now, in the brief summary that I just read, I mentioned that there were basically three kinds of meaning, and I refer to those as the meta-functions. What are they? The representational or ideational, the interpersonal, the textual. Why do we call them meta-functions? Because whatever purpose to which we put language, these three, the ideational, the interpersonal, the textual, are overall the functions that language serves, that any language serves. By virtue of it being language, these are the functions that it must serve. It must have a way to talk about our experience. It must have a way to enact relationships, build relationships. There must be a way in language to turn our ideas and turn our expectations about relationships, to turn those into concrete use of language, utterance. We are calling it the text. The text is making concrete, whether it's in writing or whether it's speaking, these functions to which we put language. Now, that's meaning. But we said that that meaning then is realized grammatically. And by grammatically, another word that we could use to say that is realized in wording. No, not just words, but the combination of words. And those combinations of words, the wordings, some of you have looked at in terms of syntax. And some of you will understand grammar as being something that is syntactic. But that is largely looking at language as something which is sort of created in almost a linear kind of fashion. It has certain slots that you fill in and you link them together, and how they go together and what can go with what. That is the approach of syntax. So this is not syntax. What we're dealing with is grammar, but from a different point of view. It is not, and I'll get to this in a moment, it is not syntagmatic, but what was the word we used? Paradigmatic. What kinds of processes are taking place? Who initiates the process? Who's affected by it? What are the circumstances? Well, we summed that up as being the process, participant, circumstance. And we said that those are the choices that you're making. How to represent my experience by some verb. Is that verb going to be a doing kind of process? Or is it a mental process? Or is it the verb to be? logical? How are we, when we have a clause and an utterance and we expand on that with another idea, with another clause, how do we do so? Are they linked sort of this independent clause with this independent clause with this independent clause? Or are some of the clauses dependent on others? What are the roles of the speaker? And here, how is that indicated? How am I asking you to do something? Am I requiring something of you? Or am I wanting to give you something? How is the message organized? Now, these are when I look at wording, that's the kind of thing where we're saying that is how meaning is realized. And what I'm saying then is that this is basically the kind of structure, the kind of grammar, the resources of language that enable us to make meaning. So we've said that meaning, understood as comprised of systems of choice, paradigmatic. Now, we can represent this as a system network. Now, think of this as sort of a way, a model for explaining what is going on in language. I noticed from looking at the introduction, some of you said you were interested in sort of computational linguistics. Well, if you've done some work with computational linguistics, you might be familiar with networks. Well, here's what we call a system network. Now, what does it reflect? Well, we've said that there are three kinds of meaning: experiential, interpersonal, textual. Experiential, we've said, can be represented in terms of what kind of process is taking place. And interpersonal, we said, can be, for example, if I'm making a statement or asking a question or making a command or a request. Textual, by theme, what do I decide to put first? Now, what we're saying then is that where is the paradigm? Paradigm is a category of choices. Process type is a category of choice. Mood type, whether it's indicative, meaning it's interrogative or declarative, or imperative, it's a category of choice. How do I decide what I will put first in the clause? Well, how I will begin the clause will be, if I'm making a statement, is it the grammatical subject, or did I put a prepositional phrase there? What is going to be the theme? Some of you will remember from last week, we talked about these three kinds of meaning. We talked about, for example, what is theme? The starting point of the message, we said. So what we're saying is that when you look at this system network, it's choices. Now we have and choices. You choose a process type and a mood type and decide the theme. This and. You're making choices I'm making choices that are experiential and interpersonal and textual, all at the same time, concurrently. Now, I represent that here as sort of this angle bracket. Those are the and choices. At the same time, I have or choices. When I choose the process type, it could be doing, material, or sensing, mental, or saying, verbal, or being, relational. So I have and choices, or choices, and these are represented then in a network that shows me sort of what kind of choices there are. So I begin with a clause, that's the starting point of the network, and in so doing, I then, in my network, I'm looking at Okay, what kind of process type? Okay, is it a question or is it a statement, an imperative, and what is the theme? How does it begin? Looking at the choices. But language is not just paradigmatic. It is also probabilistic. Now, probabilistic, in what sense? Does that mean we can quantify something about language? Now, that's where system networks are important. In an interview that Professor Jim Martin, one of Halliday's students, in this interview, Jim Martin asked Professor Halliday this question. He said, this idea of probabilistic systems seems to be something quite critical in your theory, especially in terms of not losing sight of the way in which the text feeds back into the system. Now, the system, the meaning potential, the representation of choices, much like what we've seen here. This is the system of choices that are available. A text, an utterance is an instance from out of those choices that you make. And then when you speak, when you write the utterance, the clause, and if you have several clauses, the text represents the choices that you've made. But how does the text feed back into the system? How does our sense of the system and what are the possibilities, how's that affected by the way that we actually use language? And this is a really important concept. Now, Halliday's response was this: the great problem with the system, like we represent it as a system network, is that it is a very static form of representation. It looks quite fixed, right? Fixed. I have it represented here. These are the choices. Of course, what you're looking at here is a greatly simplified system network, but it suits our purpose for now. Now, the great problem, Halliday says, with the system is that it is a very static form of representation. It looks like that's it. That's the choices you have. It freezes the whole thing. And then you have to show how the actual process of making paths through the system changes the system. Got that? As I'm working my way through this system network and I'm making choices. Now, of course, the system network is a theory. It's a metaphor for how we construct language, how we produce language. But nonetheless, in this metaphor, in this theory, representing it as a system network, the choices that you have, that almost like saying that's it. I've given you the inventory of choices that you have to make, and that's it. But Halliday is saying that the way you actually use language, when you work your way through those choices, you're defining the system. The system is defined through the instances that make up language. As he says here, each pass through the system. Each time you produce a clause, each pass through the system changes the system. Every time you talk, every time you produce a text, you change the system. How do you do that? How do you change the system? How can that system network incorporate the idea of that language is evolving, that language is changing? How can a static form of representation allow for a dynamic, for something that is really and truly dynamic. Language evolves. Language changes. All right, now, think of it this way. Very simply. Now, I know this concept can be hard to grasp. So let's try and deal with it. Let's try to get a handle on it. Think of it like this. You have two layers. You have meaning and you have wording. Now, that is what we call a perspective on language that is stratification. Strata, layers. They're connected. But at the same time, another perspective on this would be that language is also instantial. That you have the instances of language, what Saussure called parole, and you have the system of language, langue, and they're connected as almost like a cline, almost like a continuum, going from the instances to the system. So you have two perspectives here. We're going to incorporate that into one sort of model here. As you can see, now my layers have arrows on the end of it because it is instantial. On the one side is the instances of language, actual meaning making. On the other side, on the right-hand side, if you look at your screen, you have the system, you have the meaning potential, the choices that are available to you, the potential. So you have the actual instance of making meaning, and you have the meaning potential, the choices that are available to you. And we're saying that that is sort of represented as a cline, as a continuum. Now, at the same time, we're saying that the two layers, the two strata, meaning and grammar, are connected. Things are represented as nouns. Processes are represented as verbs. An analogy. Climate and the weather. What is the climate and what is the weather? They are the same and yet they're different, right? Climate, that is a generalization that is made over time. If I talk about the climate of Hong Kong, I'd be able to sort of predict what the weather would be like. We have a sense, right, that this time of year, January, what the weather would be like, what the temperature would be like, how dry would it be, how humid would it be, all those things, all right? This is the climate. But if I go right outside now, that's the weather. Climate is a generalization made over time. Weather is what occurs at some point in time. So Halliday says this, climate then may be thought of as a theory about the weather. Now, both, as he points out, clearly refer to the same phenomena. As I said, they are the same, yet they are different. Climate is a generalization. It is a theory. The weather is actually there. So Halliday takes it a step further, takes the analogy and says this, just as climate is a theory of the weather, so too the system of meaning potential is a theory of the text. Climate is a theory of the weather. We can follow that quite easily. Now, take that analogy. And the system of meaning potential, this is a generalization, this is a theory of the instances of language. It is a theory of the text. Now, add to this the sense, and Halliday did, some of you have done corpus linguistics. Well, Halliday was doing corpus linguistics quite a long time ago, and that was really before there was a lot that had been developed in terms of corpora and so forth. Halliday was very interested in this idea, and he felt that really any linguistics has to be a corpus kind of linguistics, corpus-based kind of linguistics. What he and another colleague did was go through their corpus and identify the use of tense, among other things, all right? So in terms of primary tense, that they found was that throughout their corpus, it was almost like half-half. Past, non-past. Half of it would be past tense, half of it would be non-past. And the non-past, 10% would be, well, 11% would be future. And 89, so almost like 9 to 1, present over future. What he says was then we can add these sort of probabilities to the system network. Okay, now think about that. As you get more data into your corpus, or as you use language, if we think of language that we are working with as something which is a kind of sort of system network of choices, and with the probabilities attached to them based on what we've heard, the frequencies that we've heard, what has been said, which is in fact how children learn language. Every time you hear something, every time you speak, what's happening to those probabilities? They're adjusting. You see, that is what's happening in language. That's how language changes. The probabilities, the choices change in terms of how often, and you can change. Language does change. Each utterance, each instance of language received by and produced by the individual perturbs. What's perturb? Think of it like that. Throw a pebble into a pool of still water. What happens? You see it ripple out, right? You've perturbed the water, and you are perturbing the probabilities. Every time you speak, every time you hear. What does that mean? That means, how can I know the system of language? How can I know long? Except only through the text. That's why text linguistics is so necessary, because it is the means by which we really know what language is. Whenever you look at language, how can you know? How can you say that what you're talking about? How can you make generalizations about language except by looking at the text? Because language is it's a theoretical concept. It's a generalization that you are making on the basis of language in use. Halliday gave a very interesting lecture about how language evolves. He presented it, this was back in 2010, at International Systemic Congress that was held, and in this it's also printed in the 11th volume of his collected works. I am the editor of his collected works, and there are 11 volumes. And this, the 11th volume, Halliday in the 21st Century. So the talk itself is there's a video of it. There's also, it's printed in this volume. One little snippet I want to play for you from this talk.
I mean, even within one language, we can see kind of new patterns in the integration of the meta functions, right? Because meanings are now often packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks to accommodate the reduced space on a small screen and perhaps the reduced attention span of today's interactions. Now, this means it's a curious consequence of this. It means that both interpersonal and textual meanings take on a new prominence, although for different reasons. The textual in integrating these various semiotic strands, with the interesting consequence that it becomes less explicit in the text. You know, it's rather like the subtitles in a foreign language movie sort of thing. The interpersonal, on the other hand, becomes more explicit as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized. Just for example, on our television screens of Parliament in Canberra, we are never shown parliamentary debates, only the ranting and swapping of abuses that are thought to make good television. So the whole of politics in that way is simply personalized and individuated. Now here, of course, you can hear the interpersonal component intruding into my own text, because it is clear that I don't like to find so much of meaning reduced to a series of bite-sized chunks. And I don't like the way that any thoughtful discourse by those we have elected to govern us is overtaken by verbal brawling. And I blame the media for it. You can hear the scare quotes just now when I referred to good television. Now, okay, this is just one small symptom, not in itself important, but then we are told that symptoms never are. I'm doubtful about this. But it is symptomatic of a process that I talked about somewhere else as the destruction of knowledge. A destruction of knowledge which, as an old-fashioned socialist and lifelong Marxist, I see as part of the death throes of what is now corporate capitalism.
Okay, now what were the points that Professor Halliday made here? In what direction is language evolving? Now he's making some quite critical comments. He talks about the fact that meanings are packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks. And you can see that in the way technology is changing the way that we communicate. In so doing, by the fact that we are communicating in just these bits, these bite-sized chunks of information, what can fit on a small screen within how many number of characters or letters, the interpersonal is becoming more prominent, more explicit. As he says, as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized, the interpersonal is becoming more significant than the textual. The textual, he says, is becoming less explicit. It's almost like the subtitles in a foreign language film. That's how we communicate. And the product of that in terms of political discourse, as he points out in Australia, but it's certainly not confined to Australia, is overtaken by verbal brawling. In other words, he sees the influence of technology as having an impact on how we communicate. And the paper itself, the lecture that he gave here, it's not just this bit is part of the lecture, but he's talking about the influence of writing, of publishing, printing All of these have had an impact on the way that we use language. That's not just true of the past, it's true of today. The direction that language is going, he is quite a critical comment. He makes quite a critical comment. Well, you don't have to look far to see an illustration of this. Donald Trump, his tweets. Well, no longer, since he's not allowed to tweet anymore. But before, especially when he became president, this was sort of the way he communicated.
What's the point? Trump is no longer a candidate. He doesn't have to persuade us to vote for him. I mean, you could spend a lot of time looking at a tweet like this from the president-elect of the United States, scratching your head. You could wonder about the message or the distraction it causes or the headlines it generates. But if that's the way you think, this man will always baffle you. Trump doesn't resemble other politicians on Twitter. He resembles the rest of us. He resembles that person you know on Facebook who is posting all the time about how happy they are. These people don't tweet or post because they're trying to relay relevant information. They do it to carefully craft their own identities against some imagined audience that exists only to reinforce what they need to believe. The media and the public act like Trump's tweets contain messages that we're meant to receive, when the truth is, I think that he's not thinking of us at all. When you look at it through this lens, Trump's Twitter account makes a lot more sense. It makes sense that a lot of his congratulatory tweets are self-congratulatory, and his negative tweets, which account for an astounding majority, are personal in their attacks and sense of victimization. And it makes sense that we should react to it so strongly. We're all in this age of social media intimately familiar with this kind of behavior. We do it ourselves every day. What we're not familiar with, not yet at least, is this kind of thing from the most powerful person in the world. How it will fall out when you hold a position where even your words, desperately tweeted into the void, have global impact. But give it time, and we will be.
You know, one cannot help but find it interesting to see how that played out in terms of U.S. politics. Nonetheless, returning to the point I've been making, what are the properties of systems of meaning? First of all, paradigmatic. We represent those paradigms as categories within this system network. Choices. We attach to these choices probabilities, because language is, yes, probabilistic. These two factors, paradigmatic, probabilistic, play an important role in then defining the systems of meaning by which we communicate in language. Now, next, having sort of talked about what is language, and I hope that you begin to see that the perspective that we're coming at it is that if you really want to know what language is, you have to go through the text. Because it is by means of the text, it is by means of the way we use language that language exists. Language is a theory of the text. So let's expand on that now. We're going to take a look at text. And again, sort of, because whenever we're talking about language, we're talking in metaphors. Our theory, every theory is a metaphor for what it is that we're theorizing. That's what Halliday said. So texture. Architecture. One of the requirements every language has to meet is that of texture. Every text exhibits some degree of texture. Texture is what makes a text into a cohesive, coherent piece of language. Otherwise, it'd just be unorganized string of sentences put together. One aspect of texture is cohesion. Cohesion is one aspect of texture. It deals with how successive sentences are integrated together to form a whole. Halliday calls this inter-sentence texture. Inter-sentence texture. Because it is realized across clauses, across sentences that make up the text. The other aspect of texture has to do with what Halliday calls fit to context. Fit to context. Choices based on what the speaker wants to say, expressed as theme. The choices of how you begin the clause. Choices related to the flow of information. How you represent given, how you signal to the listener. This is something I've mentioned before. This is old information. Was given to you. This here is the new information. Intra-sentence texture. Because it is realized, because it is identifiable within the clause. Within the clause. The choice of theme is what takes place within the clause. How given and new information is indicated and signaled and located is within the clause. Inter-sentence texture, cohesion. Intra-sentence texture, fit to context. That's one aspect, that's texture. We're going to talk more about this. This is what I'm going to be introducing beginning this week. And the next we're going to deal with is architecture. What we're saying is that a text is composed of parts. We call them functionally significant text spans. How are they identifiable? By their texture. And these functionally significant spans, which we can see in terms of sort of, if we're talking about top to bottom, the bottom of the text, the smallest grammatical unit would be the clauses. A clause is a functionally significant text span, but you know, of course, that a text builds into a hierarchy of organization. Clauses combine to form sentences that consist of more than one clause. Sentences form paragraphs. Paragraphs begin sections, and so on. The patterning of relations between functionally significant text spans at both clause level and above plays a significant role in contributing to the architecture, rhetorical structure of the text. In this sense, we're going to be going beyond systemic functional linguistics to something called rhetorical structure theory, which is related to SFL. We could say it's complementary to SFL, developed by William C. Mann, Sandra Thompson, and Christian Matheson. What they concluded was that the text structure is best understood as pairs of regions or blocks or spans of text, and these are related in some way. Their idea is what's called rhetorical structure theory. We'll take a look at that. This is where we're headed. We're going to start talking about texts, talking about their texture, talking about their architecture. Well, it's 7:50. Just right time to take a break. So we'll take a break here for 10 minutes, please, and we'll come back at the top of the hour. All right?
See you later.
Okay, just a moment, please. Okay, sorry for that. I have another computer that I use to see if everything is coming across all right. Also, so that I can use the chat window. Uh, Otherwise, the chat window blocks the screen on the host computer. So that I have to turn the sound down on the other computer. All right, so come back to the point. Here we're talking about text, texture, and architecture. What is a text? Text is meaning. Okay, understand that. Text is choice. Choices are the basis of meaning. Text is choice. A text is a semantic structure. It's a unit of meaning that is formed out of a continuous process of choice among innumerable, cannot count them, interrelated sets of semantic options, meaning choices. So, sort of fundamental to the whole idea is that choices, you're making choices. And it's not just the choices that you make, it's the choices that you don't make that are also significant. So, what is a text? All right, text is meaning, text is choice. But let's define some criteria. And this has been done by linguist Renkema 1993. Already listed out a number of features that many others have gone on later to quote, and that is that a text has cohesion, coherence, intentionality, acceptability, informativeness, situationality, intertextuality. And of course, we're going to look at each of these. Cohesion. Now, we've just been talking about the difference that Halliday makes between inter-sentence and intra-sentence texture. What did he mean by inter-sentence texture, cohesion? The connection, following Renkema, the connection which results when the interpretation of a textual element is dependent on another element in the text. For you to understand something, some element within the text, you need to know something that occurs, another element within the same text. So let's look at several types of cohesion. Reference. If the file or folder you want to create a shortcut for appears in the box beneath the look-in box, click that file or folder to select it. What is it? Pronouns, right? Okay, you is whoever is the one reading that. That file. Which file? Click that file. The one that was just mentioned. The file or folder that you want to create a shortcut for. Select it. Oh, that file. It. These are types of reference. You need to look at something else occurs within the text that allows you to understand what is that file, what is it referring to. Substitution. Two people in line, they're ordering food. The first one comes in the line and says, I'll have 2 poached eggs on toast. And the next person comes up and says, I'll have the same. Now, the same does not mean what that guy just ordered. In other words, he ordered 2 poached eggs. I'm not saying I want his 2 poached eggs. I want my own, all right? That's not, so that's not reference. It's substitution. Ellipsis. In this particular example, what's in green was gradually, it was not said, okay? It was ellipted, it was deleted. The new school should not be located in a remote part of the new territories, but should be within the existing populated areas and beyond the main transport links. Now, you fill in the gaps. You fill in what was left out. You infer what that was based on what you had already heard. You fill in the blanks. It's a kind of substitution, but it's a substitution by nothing. Conjunction. You establish a connection between two continuous passages. And, or, but, when, if, so on, and onward, all right? So the examples of conjunction. Lexical cohesion. Reiteration, where it may be repetition, may repeat the same word, or it may be synonyms of the word. Words of similar meaning, or antonyms even, opposites, cold and hot. Okay, so it's related, all right, to talking about the temperature. Hyponymy, meaning a part of. No, sorry, hyponymy is a kind of. So a car is a kind of vehicle, a truck is a kind of vehicle. Meronymy is a part of. So what's the parts of a car, for example? The tires, the steering wheel, the lights, or the headlights. Those are all parts of the car. So we're talking about a category we call reiteration, which includes all these, where you're sort of repeatedly using, if not the same word, words of similar or opposite meaning, or somehow words that are related conceptually. Collocation. A collocate would be, for example, suppose I'm playing cards. Now, what words might come up in the conversation as I'm playing cards? Deck, the deck of cards. A hand, when I'm holding the cards I'm holding in my hand. Those would be words that would to deal. Those are words that would likely co-occur given the topic of what you're talking about. All right, take a look at this example. What movie do you want to see today? Already saw Tom Cruise's latest film. Next person, I saw it too. And he was great in it. Next person, but I didn't, so don't tell me the ending. Then perhaps we should consider some other form of entertainment. Yeah, sometimes I get tired of doing the same old thing, would prefer ice skating. All right, now, what kinds of cohesion do you see in that text? Take a look at it for a moment. What do you see? What's cohesive? What ties that text together? What are the things that we've been looking at? Reference, substitution, ellipsis, conjunction, lexical cohesion. What do you see here in this text?
Substitution, movie and film.
We see lexical cohesion. They are synonyms: movie, film. There's quite a bit of reference, pronouns. Substitution, we have doing the same old thing. Doing, do is a substitute for a lot of verbs of doing. material processes, right? Same old thing, okay? So that substitutes for what you've been talking about, all right? Ellipsis, substitution by zero, but I didn't. Didn't what? You left that gap there. You ellipted it because you had already been talking about it. Again, come back, some more lexical cohesion, hyponymy, movie, ice skating. They're forms of entertainment. They are a kind of conjunctions. Again, you have another kind of lexical cohesion, meronymy, the ending. It's part of a movie, right? Now think about that as being sort of drawing the lines between what something refers to and the other element within the text that allows us to understand what we're talking about. Draw the lines so we begin to see that that's what holds a text together. It's what gives it that cohesiveness. It is a kind of texture. I mean, if you think about clothing has a cloth, has a texture, right? Some of it can be very, very fine, very tight. Some clothes, for example, is like sweaters, can be very loosely knit. So texture, we think of it, we're taking that, using it sort of metaphorically to look at a text and talk about how tightly it is sort of connected. The parts are connected, one to the other. That's cohesiveness. It gives the text an identity. Now, cohesion and coherence are two different things. What is coherence? To the extent that each element or part of a text may be understood to contribute to the overall meaning of a text as a whole, there is coherence. So, do the parts all have a unified around a particular intention, purpose? And so they all belong there. They're all part of that text. Not like you have some sort of sentence in there that has nothing whatsoever to do with the rest of the text. That would make it rather incoherent. Now, the basis of coherence is that there must be a purpose then, an intention on the part of the one creating the text, the writer or the speaker, some conscious intention of achieving a specific goal with that message, with the text. So there is an intention behind that function of language, is an intention for what it is to achieve. And everything sort of fits according to that purpose. And then it will be a coherent text. A few other points. What decides whether something's a text? One is acceptability. Responding to the text, the reader must be willing to accept the text as a text. You pick up a book, you pick up a newspaper, you read something, a magazine. As you're reading it, you're probably not even questioning, is this a text? As long as it has those properties of cohesiveness, coherence, you would accept that as a text. Besides finding the text comprehensible, you understand it, and being informative, it has a certain informativeness. It's telling you something. Readers' determination of acceptability, how you will decide the acceptability of the text, depends also on the the situationality. You view it in the context of situation within which it takes place. And intertextuality. Viewed in relation to other texts surrounding the text in question. In other words, you compare this, you're looking at it, and if it, say, were a text from and out of a textbook on linguistics, for example, you have an idea then what other textbooks are like in terms of the kind of language that is used, or what is being talked about, and so forth. So you have an expectation. And that expectation is based on the context, but also that includes other texts that you've heard before. It fits with what your expectations are. Acceptability, informativeness, situationality, intertextuality. This is a quote that I like quite a bit. I think it expresses quite well what we have in terms of the use of language. Any text is a new tissue of past citations. Bits of code, formulae, rhythmic models, fragments of social languages, etc., pass into the text and are redistributed within it. You see, you are what you hear, what you read. For there is always language before and around the text. It is out of your experience, the formulae, the rhythmic models, the fragments of social languages, all of these you take, become a part of you, your experience with language, and then are what you produce as you speak. Let me give you an example. Now, this is, if you take a look at this example here, you have, just a moment, please. As I said, I am looking also at my computer and following along to make sure that what I have on mine is what you also should be seeing. All right, just was checking it because I noticed something and I wanted to get back to look at it. All right, look at the screen. What are you looking at? You're looking at a text. And specifically it says at the top, right, help. So it's a kind of help documentation. You know, the kind of thing where you're using some kind of software and you click on the help in the menu and you're looking for an answer to a specific question about how to use the software. In this case, it's editing a linked drawing. So what does it tell you? One of the things that we notice is that it includes quite a few what are called action statements. Do you notice anything sort of repetitive about the action statements? Something that's quite consistent across all of them. Open the right file that contains the link to the drawing you want to edit. Double click anywhere in the presentation, etc. Or select the drawing, then choose. Edit the drawing as needed. 4, from the file menu, choose Save. From the file menu, 5, from the file menu, choose Exit and return to name of document. What are those? Those are all imperatives. Not questions, not statements, imperatives. It has no subject, no finite verb. Open, double click, edit, save, choose, exit. They all have a certain consistency. Now, how often do we encounter a text where repeatedly it's telling you what to do? Do this, do that, do this, do that. Now, if we were in a conversation and I was constantly giving you do this, do that, do this, do that, unless the circumstances were right, you would not be very likely very happy with that. But here, that's exactly what you want. That's what you've asked for. You've asked to give you instructions to do what to do, and in the order. So it fits the situation, right? The situation is you didn't know how to use some specific aspect of that software. You went on the write help. In this case, you're using with Microsoft Write, and the situation calls for you to receive a list of imperatives. Notice the nature of those verbs. Open, double click, edit, choose. They are all going to be related to the nature of the activity in terms of using that software. There's a certain cohesiveness about it. The situation is like that. And intertextually, well, there are actually books written about how to write help documentation. There's sort of a formula that is followed as far as how to write this kind of help documentation. There's nothing creative or innovative. You do not want creativity. You do not want innovativeness in terms of how it expresses it. You want just as simple as possible. That is what you are getting there. Intertextually, it fits with other help documentation. You read that, it's quite acceptable. It's what you expect from it. And the way the grammar operates in terms of the kind of sentence structure, imperatives, the kinds of verbs, all fit within the nature of the task itself. When we come to meaning, just to remind you, we're talking about how we construe experience. We called it ideation. What does it mean to construe? It's not a word that we use a lot, okay? You might think, well, why not maybe use the word construct? But construct means sort of something more concrete than what construe suggests. And it's sort of, as you can see, the verbs are all sort of mental, all right? It's sort of a mental construction is how you construe, how you understand, how you comprehend the world. What's going on? You also use language to enact relationships, and we said that was the interpersonal, right? And we use language to create the discourse, to turn our ideas and our relations, how we express our relations into something which is concrete. Okay? Textual. Again, call these the metafunctions. Now, the first one, the ideational one, you'll remember we broke it down into two subcomponents. So one is the reflective, the experiential, what we've just said, how you construe the world. The other aspect of this, Halliday includes the two under this ideational, and the other is the logical, how the ideas expand. The interpersonal, the textual. And so we've said that language is paradigmatic. We've established that point. And when we talk about meaning, then that translates into categories, grammatical categories. When we say grammar, this is the important point. Grammar, for how we're using that word, it means sort of the wording that is going to realize a kind of meaning. And the wording will be realizing sets of options. And so one is the process. What kinds of processes are taking place? Who initiates the process? Who's affected by it? What are the circumstances? You remember we talked about this, I talked about this in the first lecture. Let me repeat this because this is an important point I want you to grasp. And when we're talking about the type of process, is it doing, sensing, saying, and so on? Now that's one paradigm, the process type. How did we distinguish these process types? How did we say, well, there's doing, there's sensing, there's saying? How did we decide to make up these categories? We do so on the basis of how verbs behave grammatically. That's what I'm talking about. The behavior of the verb, how it works grammatically. Grammatically meaning what? In this case, what Halliday, remember, breaks it down into a few questions. For example, what did X do? What did X do to Y? Now you can ask those questions of a doing process and you can get an answer. John kicked the ball. What did John do? He kicked the ball. What did John do to the ball? He kicked it. Who can initiate a doing process? Must it be human-like, have a sense of consciousness? Not necessary. Can be non-human, human, no distinction made. Can it project? Can it take a that clause? We said, no. John kicked the ball. No, definitely, that doesn't work. You can't have the doing doesn't somehow project some other idea. So then we compared that with mental processes. You remember, John saw the bird. What did John do? He saw the bird. No, doesn't work. What did John do to the bird? He saw it. That's not doing. Seeing is not doing. Watching is doing. But not to see is a different kind of process. Now, the initiator also must be human-like, have a sense of consciousness. Cannot just be it cannot be some object that has no sense of being able to sense something. And it can take a that clause. John saw that I was cold. Well, we went through these in relational verbal processes. Now, they're like doing in some respects, they're like mental in some respects. On the one hand, you can say, what did John do? He told a joke. But you cannot say, what did John do to the joke? He told it. That sounds odd. And it can take a that clause, but unlike a mental process, the communicator of a saying process, a verbal process, need not be human. So we can distinguish all of these process types by asking these questions, by conducting these tests. Well, what do these tests show us? These tests show us that as far as the way we perceive these verbs as being, these categories as being different. We treat them differently in terms of what they will allow, what you can do with them, who can do them. Now that means that not just semantically, but grammatically, they are different. They behave differently. Halliday only distinguishes those categories that he can identify somehow they behave differently grammatically. It's not just subjective, it's objective in the sense that, yes, you can ask these questions and they do show that we see them differently. A process of sensing is for us quite different than a process of doing. Notice something about that I haven't mentioned here. If I'm asking you what you do habitually, right? Okay, so I say like, okay, every day I get up and I swim every day. Used to, pool's closed now. I swim every day. Now, what's the tense that I'm using here? Simple present. I swim every day. What does it express? It expresses that it is something which I do habitually. It is routinely, right? How can I say that it's something I'm doing right now? I'm swimming now. Well, notice I use the ing form. Verb to be, present continuous, I'm swimming. And that is something I'm doing right now. All right, now, take a mental process. How would you say, I think John should leave? What does that mean? Does it mean anything habitually? No. What does it mean? I think John should leave. That is my present thought. I think you should go. It is what I think right now. Can I say that I am thinking that you should leave? Sounds not quite right. Grammatically, it doesn't work. In other words, doing and sensing also behave differently in terms of our use of tense. To indicate an action which is, or to indicate that process is being done now, or it is something that is being done routinely, habitually. Doing, sensing, they're different. We treat them differently. They behave differently. All right, now let me ask you a few questions. All right. Which sentence contains a relational process? Mary feels you were being rude. John took the photo. Bill thinks John is at home. Now, I know I've given you the slides before, and I hope you don't rush ahead to look. Think about it a moment, okay? All of the above, Which of these contains a relational process? What's a relational process? The verb to be, the verb to have. Mary feels you were being rude. Now, I've highlighted the verbs here. Mary feels you were being rude. John took the photo. Bill thinks John is at home. What's the correct answer here? What would you say?
A and C. E. Yeah, that's E.
E, correct. Both A and C. Thank you. I'm looking at the chat. Yes. Which sentence contains a material process? Material means what? Doing process. Again, let's highlight the verbs. We heard that you weren't feeling well. The ring was stolen by a burglar. John is going to the store. Which sentence contains a material process?
D. All of the above.
We heard you weren't feeling well. Here is what? Mental, right? Weren't feeling well. Now, the verb to be there is an auxiliary verb. The main verb is feel, right? It's also mental. The ring was stolen. Now, that, again, the verb to be there is because it's the passive voice. It's an auxiliary verb. The verb to be can be a main verb or it can be an auxiliary. It can be a verb that indicates something, whether it's active versus passive, whether it's continuous tense or what the verb to be has different uses, different meanings. Was stolen. John is going to the store. So what's the correct answer? Yes, again, E, both B and C. Which sentence expresses ideational meaning? I'm not process type this time. Which sentence expresses ideational meaning? Close the door. Were there any witnesses to the accident? Tom failed the exam. Which sentence expresses ideational meaning? Well, yeah, and most of you can see, yes, it's all of the above.
Excuse
In
me.
fact, whenever we speak, there's some idea being expressed. Whenever we speak, there is some interpersonal meaning, even if it's a close the door, then you're telling someone to do something for you. When you ask, were there any witnesses to the accident, you're asking a question, you're expecting a response. It's also interpersonal. Tom failed the exam. You're telling someone something, you're giving information to someone. My role is to give, yours is to receive. So it is always ideational, always interpersonal. Is it always textual? Yes, because what is textual? Textual is what is the first element. What is the first experiential element within that clause? Tom failed the exam. Yes, that's the theme. Were there any witnesses to the accident? You're expressing the idea of being that it's a question. Close the door. Using a verb at the beginning also expresses the idea that it is an imperative. You see, language. Remember when we did that system network? It was and, ideational, and interpersonal, and textual. Language is always ideational, interpersonal, textual. Those meta functions are active and applying and there every time you use language. Okay, which of the following sentences contains a material doing process? Again, let's highlight the verbs. Could you hear? Mental. What he said? Verbal. Carol said, verbal, that she couldn't Leave, that's doing. While Tom was relational at the store, he saw the twins mental. What's the correct answer? B. All right. I think you hopefully got the idea, right? We're distinguishing the various process types. We distinguish them on the basis how they behave grammatically. Now, I know the temptation is, well, yeah, that's a kind of doing, that's a kind of sensing. But really, when you do the analysis, you have to do it on the basis of how that verb behaves with respect to the grammar. Now, let me illustrate something else with respect to verbs. You know the difference between transitive and intransitive, right? Intransitive, single participant. Tim smiled, the river flowed, the audience laughed, the girls screamed. One participant. Transitive, multiple participants. The waiter poured the tea, there's two participants. The teacher gave John the book, three participants. Bob hit the ball, the player kicked the ball. Okay, transitive, intransitive. You go to a dictionary, they'll tell you which is which, right? Is there a third type? Is there a third type? Either transitive or intransitive? Take a look at these examples. The wind opened the door. Okay, grammatical, right? Of course. The door opened. Is that passive voice?
No.
The door opened. No, it's not passive voice. You could say the door was opened by the wind. That would be the passive counterpart to the first one. The wind opened the door. But here you say the door opened. Now here basically you have a verb, open, can be either transitive, the wind opened the door, or intransitive, the door opened. The single participant, the affected only is mentioned, not the agent. But in the other example, the boy kicked the ball. The ball kicked. Cannot say that. Can't put the affected here. So kick does not work that way, but open does work that way. They're both doing processes. You can't distinguish them on that basis. No, you can't say that somehow they're different. And they could be either transitive or intransitive. Now, Halliday suggests that this really represents two different interpretations of reality. Transitive, you have the actor, the process, the goal. The actor does something which may extend beyond the actor to the goal. The wind opened the door. You mention who is the actor. You identify the actor, who did it, who is the initiator of the action. The ergative, only the affected is mentioned. The affected is involved in, actualizes some process. The door opened. All right, so we've distinguished another type of verb. You have transitive, you have intransitive, and you have either or. Now, what's interesting is, look at this. These are all examples of verbs that can go either way. Broke, glass broke, Fred broke the glass. The curtain moved, Jane moved the curtain. On down the list. Broke, to to move, to turn, to change, to spread, to shake, to bounce, so on. These are all verbs that can behave either way. Now that's what's interesting here, is that this is a change that is taking place in the language currently. We now have a category. It can be either two or one participants. We still have this distinction, most transitive, kick, for example. And we have the most intransitive, flow, only one participant. But we're gradually, there is this middle category where both transitive, and most intransitive, they're moving together and forming this other category, like open, like break, either two or one participants. Now, what we can say is that there is a tendency for this division between transitive and intransitive to break down, to dissolve, so that the verbs are moving to the center along this continuum between them. Now, this is something that we can observe taking place in the language. Which verbs are moving into this unrestricted central type? It's the verbs that occur most frequently in the language. Those verbs which occur most frequently are the ones that are being the first to move into this new category. And this is something that we can see the language is changing. In other words, the categories that we have can be changed, can in some ways be quite fluid, quite flexible. And this flexibility, that's why language is not completely logical. That's why language is not systematic, because it is subject to change, and the change is subject to the way that we use language, and the way that we use language is gradually changing the probabilities such that the language is evolving. And this language is changing. That is a well-established point. It is because we speak as we have been spoken to, but that we don't exactly duplicate. We resemble what we have heard. And in this resemblance, in this analogy, in the way that we work analogically, not logically, but analogically, language is formed. But it is continuously being formed every time we speak, every time we produce language. The probabilities are getting perturbed. They're changing. Time for a break. It's around 8:51, so let's take a break, and we'll come back at the top of the hour. Okay? Thank you. Okay. How are we doing? Just a quick question for you on the chat and so forth. Are you following okay what we're saying? Is there any question that immediately comes to mind?
Yes. Prof. Webster, can I ask a few questions? It will
Yes,
just take 2 minutes.
that's
Uh,
fine.
yeah.
By the way, excuse me before this before the break. Uh, I had a I have a headphone, but the headphone had run out of battery. So, and the speaker I have to add to this computer that I'm using. So if you were speaking to me at all in the earlier first 2 hours and I didn't seem to be responding, uh, forgive me. I don't mean to be
Huh?
impolite. I
No
just,
problem.
but I think I can hear you all right. I can hear you.
Yes. So before we talk about situationality, I was wondering if situationality means contextuality. They mean the same thing. Do they mean the same thing? Because before I also learned a word called contextuality. I feel like they are the same thing with situationality.
Situationality. I'm not sure what you've used before. What is the word you used before?
Con- Contextuality, context, and then contextuality.
I'm not
Context.
sure. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with. Maybe I'm not catching the word, but contextuality
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's this the same notion pretty much. So the
Um,
context and so on. That's what the situation is. The situation of context. Yes. So situationality, contextuality, yes, would be the same.
uh, okay. I think yeah. So far, that's the only question I have. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Anyone else in the meantime while we take a moment? Okay, it doesn't seem to be. So again, feel free to ask questions on chat, and I won't probably respond during the lecture, but I will. I usually try to do so then during the break times and so forth, and anything that follows thereafter. Uh, you can email me as well. But if there's something that comes up, I do now can hear you. So if you,
Yes, sir. Can I ask one more question about the exercises before? It's
yes.
about the exercise 4. Which of the following sentence contains a material process? Uh,
Yes.
in the definition, material process is about happen and doing. But in the sentence B, Carol said that she couldn't leave early. How can we define the leave here is related to the doing process?
Uh, I would consider leaving as doing. What are you doing? I'm leaving. Now, doing processes need not have two participants, right? So they can be intransitive, like we've noticed. But to leave is a kind of doing. I'm leaving the party now. So I can use it as a doing kind of process.
So how can we define which kind of word is related to the doing process?
Uh, Again, go back to the test. Can you say okay, so if I say John left the party, what did John do? Good point. You have a good point there. Because it would, if I go back to it and I say, okay, John is leaving the party. What is John doing? He's leaving the party. I, I can't say what did John do to the party, right? Because
Yes.
the party is not what we consider to be a goal. It's something else. In SFL, we call it another kind of participant, all right? In this case, would be the range and so forth of what's being talked about. So, in that sense, it doesn't have two participants. It has, uh, in that sense, it's a single participant process. But what you're talking about is what he's leaving, and that would be the party. That's probably not very clear. Do you follow it all or not?
A little bit confused about the examples.
Okay, so for example, if I say John climbed the mountain, what did John do to the mountain? He climbed it. But it's not really a due to the mountain, right? That he
Yes.
climbed it. And that's why Halliday distinguishes it as being not sort of the goal, as in I I broke the I broke the cup. What did I broke the cup. What did I do? I broke the cup. What did I do to the cup? I broke it. In that sense, it is the goal of the action. But in the mountain, as in the sense I climbed the mountain, I can't really say what did I do to the mountain. I didn't do something to the mountain. It's what I where I, for example, climbed, and that is the mountain. We call that then the range. So it is a different kind of participant in that sense. And so we would not consider it to be sort of like a two participant process. So in the sense, I can't say due to, but that's not this matter of the verb itself or the process. It's more the nature of the other participant is not the goal. It's another kind of participant, the range.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
so the question comes back then to what did, how do you define a doing process? Can it be substituted by do? If it can be substituted by do, then you have a doing kind of process.
Okay,
And the initiator can be human or need not be human. In the sense of leaving, then I mean it will be someone who will be in the sense of to leave. The Can we use anything that would not be human? It doesn't have, it can be human or non-human, but the issue is, does it have a sense of, does it require a sense of consciousness? And to leave something does not require a sense of consciousness, it's an action. All right, so what I would come back to is when you talk about the process types, how to distinguish them, that's why we try to apply these various tests and so forth to determine which fit into what category. Now, I've not even talked about behavioral processes. Behavioral processes are processes that are like doing, like to sleep. He's sleeping. These would be more likely to be intransitive processes. So behavioral are like doing. So if I say he's sleeping now, yes, I can say what is he doing, but it is something which is it requires a kind of human-like agency to be able to carry out that process. So in that sense, it behaves somewhat like material, but it also is somewhat like mental. I think what you should begin to notice is that the process types are, in some ways, some are very obvious. That's very obvious doing. That's very obvious sensing. But there are some process types that will also be maybe more difficult to fit into which category. Now, does that mean that the whole idea of the various distinctions we've made, material, mental, verbal, do not apply? No. The reason being that language itself is fuzzy. It will not be surprising then that the categories which we use to define the grammar of a language will also be fuzzy. The grammatical categories that we identify of process type will be somewhat, in some cases, very obvious. Other cases may be more fuzzy, indeterminate, but that is the nature of language. Okay,
okay,
thank
thank you.
you. Very good question. Thank you for asking the question. And
Thank
it
you.
was a very good question because it did it did bring out the point that it's somewhat sometimes difficult to identify the process type. And there are other factors involved that I've not been mentioning. I mean, we have an actor in the goal, but then we have another participant type range, which describes another aspect of the grammar. But thank you for asking the question. Okay, I think that we'll go on then to the next topic. I want to illustrate something about process types with this example. And now this is he was a famous writer, American writer, postmodern writer. His name is David Foster Wallace, and he gave a commencement speech at a university, and the title of it was "This is Water." What I want to take a look at is this speech, and I want to take a look at it in terms of the way the choices of processes and what they reveal about the nature of how that text was constructed. I'm going to play a bit of it for you. What I'm going to suggest is that we notice that the text itself seems to break down into three segments. Now, these segments seem to have a sort of somehow a different identity with respect to the nature of the process type. Again, what I'm trying to establish is that when we have this distinction between the various kinds of processes, what does that tell us? Now, I gave you the example the other day, last week, between Donald Jung and Susan Rice, and who was the initiator of the action. And we could see that they were quite different in terms of how they construed the world and how that came through in their choice of language. Now, here, what I'm trying to illustrate is that the nature of the sort of the cohesiveness is not in the repetition of the verbs per se, but in the repetition of verbs of a similar process type. In other words, this grammatical category of process type is something else that defines the cohesiveness. And in this case, we can identify three sort of what I would call functionally significant spans of text within this speech that he's about to give. Now, listen to it and let me illustrate it when we've listened to it. What we're going to notice is that the types of process are gradually becoming more mental. Gradually, as the speech progresses, the mental process is what becomes more prominent. When it begins, doing is largely what is being talked about. In the second segment, more relational. And in the third, we notice that the mental has become more prominent than previously. Now, what's the significance? More material, more doing, more being, more thinking, more mental. But that sort of shows the nature of how what he's developing, what he's saying, what he's trying to put across in this text.
There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. Nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" The point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Stated as an English sentence, of course, this is just a banal platitude. But the fact is that in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can have a life or death importance. The plain fact is that you graduating seniors do not yet have any clue what day in, day out really means. There happen to be whole, large parts of adult American life that nobody talks about in commencement speeches. One such part involves boredom, routine, and petty frustration. The parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. By way of example, let's say if I choose to think this way in the store and on the freeway, fine. Lots of us do. Except thinking this way tends to be so easy and automatic that it doesn't have to be a choice. It is my natural default setting. It's the automatic way that I experience the boring, frustrating, crowded parts of adult life when I'm operating on the automatic, unconscious belief that I am the center of the world and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priorities. The thing is that, of course, there are totally different ways to think about these kinds of situations. In this traffic, all these vehicles stuck and idling in my way, it's not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accidents in the past and now find driving so terrifying that their therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge, heavy SUV so they can feel safe enough to drive. Or I can choose to force myself to consider the likelihood that everyone else in the supermarket's checkout line is just as bored and frustrated as I am, and that some of these people probably have much harder, more tedious or painful lives than I do. Again, please don't think I'm giving you moral advice or that I'm saying you're supposed to think this way or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard. It takes will and effort, and if you are like me, some days you won't be able to do it, or you just flat out won't want to. But most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of her husband who's dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicles department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's also not impossible. It just depends what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is and who and what is really important, if you want to operate on your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to think, how to pay attention, then you will know you have other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that lit the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. Not that that mystical stuff's necessarily true. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. This, I submit, is the freedom of real education, of learning how to be well-adjusted. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. That is real freedom. That is being educated and understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing.
Now, notice something about how that text progressed. As we said already, the first part seems to be largely about doing. And if we take the word clouds as somewhat of an indication of the kinds of process type in each of these 3 sort of sections. Now, what defined the section? What defines the section is the cohesiveness. The cohesiveness involved in the repetition of processes in a given category, whether it be doing or being or mental thinking. Now, yes, of course, you have a mix of processes. You have some verb to be in the first part and some verbs of doing in the second part. What we're talking about is what becomes more prominent, what it becomes more about. And the first part is more about doing. Second part is more about being. And the third part more about thinking. Now, that seems to be the case with the choice of process type. Now, at the top row, correspondingly, I have indicated what's the topical theme. Remember what's theme? Theme is how each clause begins. What do you notice about the first part? You. You. Doing. It's by way of example, it's sort of making a connection with the audience in terms of this is your daily life. The second part, what stands out here? You notice I, not so much you. When it talks about I am, I and the verb to be, what is he in this second section? It's at this point that you'll notice he's very negative about his perception of what's going on, that it's he paints it in a very negative light. But this negativity about how one can see one's life, he attributes to not you, not the audience, but to himself. This is what he's saying he is. This is what his view of life is. Third part. Notice that, yes, there's still I there, but notice here again what stands out is you. Now let's come back to you. And what is it you think? Now notice this part begins, please don't think that I'm giving you moral advice. What is the whole point of this particular speech that he's giving? It's about how one can think more positively about one's daily life. And instead of seeing life as being revolving all around oneself, one looks at it from the standpoint of other people. Not like you're the center of the universe, not selfishly. But that's the point of what he's saying here. He's saying, I don't want to be like I'm giving you moral advice and telling you what to think, but that is exactly what he is doing. It is about what you think in the end and how you see it. Take your daily life, that view of life you can have, which is very negative. He attributes it to himself. He takes on board the negativity, but then he is basically urging a different perspective that you think about it in a better light, in another way. Do you see how the speech itself develops along this pathway? It unfolds how? It unfolds, and we see it in these three sections, that each of which is defined with a cohesiveness. The cohesiveness is not just in the repetition of words, but in the repetition of choices from grammatical categories. Which process type? What is theme? What is mentioned at the beginning of each of these clauses? Is it I? Is it first person, or is it you? You see, that's how the text unfolds. And so we need these grammatical categories to give us an idea, to help us see how that text is unfolding, how he is making meaning. A text has cohesiveness. That cohesiveness is the texture of a text. And it involves also it is both intersentence and intrasentence texture. What is actually then being developed is an architecture. How that text as a whole is put together, how the various parts come to build up the whole text to achieve that writer, that speaker's intention. The architecture identifies the coherent structuring of the text. Yes, I attribute the cohesiveness to the texture and the coherence to the architecture of the text. I'm going to begin today to also introduce you to rhetorical structure theory. Now, the slides that I've given you for today we'll be carrying on and continuing next time. And I would very much appreciate that if you have questions, please let me know. Email me. Let me know what questions you have, and I will certainly try to answer them. I'm going to probably next week come back to this point about identifying the process type. I appreciated the questions that were raised earlier, and very good questions, but I felt I didn't get the point across well, and so I will come back to that to try to clarify, because this is an important point about that the process types can be identified, not just in terms of a difference in meaning, this is doing, this is sensing, but in terms of how they behave grammatically. And why would I consider leave, for example, to leave as a doing process? On what basis? Well, I'm going to come back to that next week, and I'm going to try to make the argument stronger so that this point gets across. Because those categories indeed are important. Because what we're looking for in a sense of cohesiveness is not just, as I've tried to say, not just words, but also the categories, grammatical categories, the same process type, the same theme. Those define and give a sense of cohesiveness by their prominence to blocks of text. And those blocks of text are then built up sequentially, hierarchically, in such a way as to let you see in the end then what is the message, what is the intention of the writer. And so that's why what we're going to look at now is another aspect of it. It's a wider aspect. It's going beyond looking at those grammatical categories that we observe in each clause to looking at how the text as a whole is put together. And to do that, we are going to involve this rhetorical structure theory. And there is a reading that I put under the readings, which is related to this RST. I mentioned it at the beginning of class. Take a look at it between now and next time, all right? Let me go through a few points in order to sort of lay the groundwork for what we'll be looking at more next week. What are some underlying assumptions of rhetorical structure theory? That a text has an organization. That organization means that the text is comprised of functionally significant spans. Now, what does that mean? It means a block of text. Now, what can constitute a functionally significant span? It can be a clause, as I said. It could be clauses combined into a sentence, punctuated as a sentence. It can be a group of sentences that are together form a paragraph, on and on like that, up to the text as a whole at the top. Now there will be a sense of unity to which each of these parts then, all the various parts of the text sort of contribute. And it all relates to the writer's purpose, the intention of the writer. We're going to see smaller parts, elementary parts composed into larger parts. There's a hierarchy. Clauses into complex clauses or sentences, sentences into paragraphs, and on and on and on. Let me give you an illustration. Take this letter to the editor of a student newspaper. All right, now, take a moment, read this, would you? Take a moment to read it. What is this writer? What is the intention of the writer? The writer is writing, it's a school newspaper. The UCSD is University of California, San Diego. It's a student newspaper. This person is writing to the editor of the newspaper to complain. Complaining about Megan Durham's April 30th column, Job Seekers Beware Scams Target Rookies. It's a complaint. She's finding fault with this article, this column. She says so at the beginning. Though I found Megan's column informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me. And then she goes on to explain first this, secondly this, in addition this. All right, so we begin to see a hierarchical structure to this, right? We can see the introduction sort of topic sentence begins, though I found Megan's column informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me. And this is then developed in the body of the letter. And that body of the letter then can be broken down into first, secondly, in addition. There's a clear hierarchy there. Now, what they are saying is that in rhetorical structure theory is that these parts there's relations between the pairs of parts. Each part is related to another part. And the kinds of relations that exist between the parts of a text is a finite set. Not infinite, not a limit, it's a limited, finite set of relations. So identify the relations and then you're able to explain what is how the text is put together. Now, kinds of relations that are mentioned, some are symmetrical. Some are like sequence, 1 and 2 and 3 and so on. Some are contrast, so it's just a even, this is one side, this is the other side. Then you have some that are asymmetrical, some that are, one part is more important, more nuclear than the other, which is more peripheral. Satellites. So we have the nucleus and we have the satellites. Let's explain. Though I found Megan's column informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me. Now, let's take that to be sort of, that is the main idea. That's it. A few aspects troubled me. And we're going to show that by saying that there's sort of this vertical line. That's the first part here. All right, the first topical sentence. Now, paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, they are all elaborating on that main idea. So we'll say that this relationship of elaboration is asymmetrical. You have paragraphs 2, 3, 4, they all sort of give more information about what troubled us all. Now, in rhetorical structure theory, each relation is defined. For example, elaboration. The satellite. What's the satellite? The satellite is paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. Presents additional detail about the situation or some element of subject matter which is presented in the nucleus. Now, what's the nucleus? Well, that's the part with the vertical line above it. That's paragraph 1. Satellite presents additional detail about some element of subject matter in the nucleus in one or more of these ways listed below. And how is it here? Are they members of a set? No. Instances of some abstract concept? No. Parts of a whole? No. Steps in a process? No. Attributes of an object? No. These are the specifics of a generalization. Some aspects troubled me. That's a generalization. First, second, in addition. These are the specifics. Well, the effect. What is the response? The response is the reader will recognize that the situation in each of these satellites, paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, gives additional detail about what aspects troubled her. Right? Seems very straightforward, right? All right, so we've got that down, but now let's take, all of this goes down to the very bottom. Now, the very bottom is the clauses. So 1A and 1B, those are two clauses. Though I found Megan's column informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me. What's the relationship between A and B here? Which is the main idea? Though I found Megan's column informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me. B, a few aspects troubled me. That is the main idea. Now, what's the relationship? Concession. What does that mean? Well, the giveaway here is though. Though, the conjunction though expresses what we call concession. A, you're saying correct, true, yes, it holds, but B is more important. It is more the point that is being expressed here. You concede the truth of one while putting all your emphasis on the truth of the other. Yes, you're saying it wasn't like Megan's column was not informative and not topical. It was, but now I've just been using the conjunction but is also a marker of can be, contrast, or concession. Concession. Though is a very obvious one. Though, although, even though indicate concession. Now, how do you decide, though, what is the main idea and what is the satellite? How do you decide A points to B? Well, that's why you have a relation defined here in rhetorical structure theory. The writer has positive regard for the situation presented in the nucleus. In other words, a few aspects trouble me. That's the point that this writer is making. That's what she believes. That's what the writer wants to impress upon this editor of the newspaper. This is the point being argued for. That's the nucleus. The satellite writer is not claiming that the situation presented in the satellite does not hold. Not saying it's not true. That's the satellite. That's A. The effect, hopefully, is that the reader will have positive regard for the situation presented in the nucleus, and then it'll be increased. You notice something, though. The definition of the relations are not grammatical. They are semantic. They have to do with interpretation. One more. First, Megan says, it doesn't hurt to keep your social security number and date of birth off your resume. She first says what Megan says. I highlighted it in blue here. And now her point will be taken up in 2, 3, and 4. Megan is drastically understating her point. Job seekers should under no circumstances include their social security number on their resume. To do so is to invite identity theft. Point, counterpoint, right? Why is it not symmetrical? Why is it not contrast? Megan says this. I say this. If I were the writer of the letter. Antithesis or antithesis. The nucleus is what the writer has positive regard for. This is what the letter writer is saying. 2 through 4, that's her point. What Megan says is the point that she is countering. The situations are in contrast, but the one is what the writer favors and what the writer is arguing for. And with the effect that the reader will hopefully agree with the writer. This is antithesis. It is contrast, but one side is favored over the other, very clearly. Megan is drastically understating her point. Job seekers should under no circumstances include their social security number on their resume. To do so is to invite identity theft. I'm going to go through this quickly. 3 and 4. Megan is drastically understating her point. How? 3 and 4 elaborate. 3 and 4, how are they related? Job seekers should under no circumstances include their social security number on their resume. Justify that. Why is that the case? To do so is to invite identity theft. Do you see? What we're saying is that for a text, all the parts hierarchically come together with the intention of the writer, the purpose of the writer, coherently. If it is coherent, all the parts should relate together. What are those relations? We looked at 3, antithesis, elaboration, justify. Oh, we also looked at concession. These are the relations that in rhetorical structure theory are defined. And the basis for identifying this is the architecture. This is the main point of what's being expressed. Justify, here's the definition. Now, it's 9:47. I'm going to leave you with this. Go online, go to this website and you'll find more information about rhetorical structure theory. In our course, in this course, we are going to be looking at systemic functional and rhetorical structure theory. Why? Because systemic functional only takes us to looking at the grammatical categories related to the clause. And we need to go beyond the clause to look at the text as a whole. I leave you with this thought. Halliday says the clause is the most basic lexico-grammatical unit, and the text is a semantic unit. The text is a unit of meaning. The clause is a unit of grammar. We'll talk about that more next time. But I'm going to stop here. And next time, again, as I said, I'm going to come back to that point about the categories of process type. I do feel I need to explain that better. And we'll be picking up where we left off here on rhetorical structure theory. You have the additional slides, but right now, try to consolidate what we've covered so far. And don't worry about the slides yet to come. I'll be talking about those next time, okay? So in the meantime, questions, send them by email and look forward to hearing from you. And if you have not done the Introduce Yourself survey, do so. Is there a syllabus for the course? There is the course description, and I can put that up on the Canvas as well later, okay? I see that from the chat. All right, so I'm going to say good night and see you next week. Okay?
Good night. Thank you.